Loving a narcissist is one of the most psychologically disorienting and emotionally exhausting experiences a person can endure, yet it is also one of the least understood from the outside. At first glance, these relationships can appear normal, even enviable. The narcissistic partner may come across as charming, confident, attentive, and deeply engaging. They can be charismatic in social settings, admired by others, and capable of presenting a polished version of themselves that attracts admiration and validation. But beneath that surface lies a deeply unstable relational dynamic that slowly erodes the emotional, cognitive, and even physical well-being of the person who loves them. What makes this experience uniquely difficult is not just the mistreatment itself, but the persistent confusion that surrounds it. Unlike more overtly abusive dynamics, narcissistic relationships often blur the line between love and harm, leaving the victim questioning their own perception of reality. One of the most defining characteristics of loving a narcissist is the constant state of confusion. This confusion is not incidental, it is structural. It emerges from repeated cycles of contradiction, inconsistency, and psychological manipulation. One moment, the narcissist may be warm, affectionate, and validating. The next, they may become cold, critical, or even hostile, often without any clear or logical trigger. This unpredictability creates an unstable emotional environment where the person on the receiving end is always trying to anticipate the next shift, always adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict, and always wondering what they did wrong. Over time, this leads to a breakdown in the ability to trust one's own thoughts, feelings, and interpretations. The person begins to second-guess themselves constantly, unsure whether their reactions are justified or whether they are, in fact, the problem. Gaslighting plays a central role in reinforcing this confusion. In a narcissistic relationship, reality itself becomes negotiable. The narcissist may deny things they clearly said or did, reinterpret past events in ways that absolve them of responsibility, or accuse their partner of being overly sensitive, irrational, or even unstable. Statements like, "I never said that," "You're imagining things," or "You're too emotional," are not just dismissive, they are destabilizing. They undermine the victim's confidence in their own memory and perception. As this pattern repeats, the individual may begin to rely less on their internal sense of truth and more on the narcissist's version of events, even when it contradicts their lived experience. This is where the confusion becomes deeply internalized, transforming from a situational response into a chronic psychological state. Another hallmark of loving a narcissist is the emergence of self-gaslighting. After being repeatedly invalidated, criticized, or dismissed, individuals often begin to adopt the language and beliefs of the narcissist. They may describe themselves as too sensitive, too needy, or too emotional, even when their reactions are entirely appropriate given the circumstances. This internalization is not a sign of weakness. It is a survival mechanism. By accepting the narcissist's narrative, the individual attempts to make sense of the chaos and maintain some semblance of stability in the relationship. However, this comes at a significant cost. It leads to a disconnection from one's authentic emotional experience and fosters feelings of shame and guilt, particularly around expressing vulnerability or seeking support. Guilt, in fact, becomes one of the most powerful emotional forces in a narcissistic relationship. It operates as a kind of psychological glue that keeps the relationship intact, even when it is clearly harmful. The person may feel guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for expressing dissatisfaction, guilty for considering leaving, and even guilty for recognizing that the relationship is unhealthy. This guilt is often amplified by the narcissist's tendency to deflect responsibility and project blame. When something goes wrong, It is rarely framed as a shared issue or the narcissist's fault. Instead, the responsibility is subtly or overtly shifted onto the other person. Over time, the individual begins to believe that they are the source of the problem, that if they could just be better, more patient, more understanding, or less reactive, the relationship would improve. This belief feeds into another deeply damaging narrative: the idea of not being enough. In a narcissistic relationship, there is an implicit standard that is impossible to meet. The person may go to great lengths to please the narcissist, to anticipate their needs, to avoid triggering negative reactions, and to maintain harmony. They may take on more responsibilities, suppress their own needs, and constantly adjust their behavior in an effort to get it right. But no matter how much they do, it never seems to be sufficient. There is always something missing, something wrong, something that could have been done better. This creates a relentless cycle of striving and failing, reinforcing the belief that they are fundamentally inadequate. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that it is not about being enough in an objective sense. It is about the impossibility of ever achieving enough within the framework of a narcissistic relationship. The narcissist's reactions are often driven by their own internal insecurities, shame, and need for control, rather than by anything the other person has done. This means that even the most minor or unrelated events can trigger disproportionate responses. A casual comment, a neutral observation, or even a positive statement can be met with anger or criticism, depending on the narcissist's internal state at that moment. As a result, the person learns that there is no reliable way to navigate the relationship, no consistent set of behaviors that will ensure safety or approval. This unpredictability creates an environment that feels less like a partnership and more like a system of control. Many individuals describe it as living under constant surveillance, where every word and action is monitored, evaluated, and potentially used against them. They become hypervigilant, always scanning for signs of disapproval, always calculating the safest way to respond. This level of vigilance is mentally and emotionally exhausting, and it leaves little room for authenticity, spontaneity, or genuine connection. The relationship becomes less about mutual support and more about managing risk, avoiding conflict, and maintaining a fragile equilibrium. At the same time, the narcissist often maintains a very different image in public. They may be seen as kind, generous, successful, or even admirable. Friends, family members, and colleagues may express envy or admiration for the relationship, unaware of what is happening behind closed doors. This creates a secondary layer of confusion and isolation. The person may feel invalidated not only by the narcissist, but also by the broader social environment. When others praise the narcissist or describe them as wonderful, it can lead the individual to question their own judgment even further. They may think, if everyone else sees them this way, maybe I'm the problem. This social reinforcement of the narcissist's image acts as a form of collective gaslighting, making it even harder for the person to trust their own experience. Another critical aspect of loving a narcissist is the asymmetry of emotional labor. In a healthy relationship, there is a degree of reciprocity. Both individuals make efforts to understand each other, to support each other, and to respond to each other's needs. In a narcissistic relationship, this balance is fundamentally disrupted. One person becomes the primary giver, the empathizer, the problem solver, and the emotional caretaker. They invest significant time and energy into understanding the narcissist's feelings, motivations, and history, often making excuses for their behavior and extending compassion even in the face of mistreatment. In contrast, The narcissist rarely offers the same level of understanding or support. The flow of empathy is largely one-directional. This imbalance is not always immediately apparent. In the early stages of the relationship, the narcissist may engage in behaviors that create a strong sense of connection and intimacy. This can include intense attention, flattery, and a sense of being uniquely understood or valued. However, as the relationship progresses, these behaviors often diminish or become conditional. The initial intensity is replaced by criticism, withdrawal, or entitlement. The person may find themselves longing for the earlier phase, believing that if they can just do something differently, they can bring it back. This hope becomes another factor that keeps them engaged, even when the present reality is painful. Over time, the cumulative impact of these dynamics can be profound. The individual may experience increased anxiety, depression, and a sense of emotional numbness. They may feel disconnected from their own needs, unsure of their identity, and hesitant to trust their own decisions. Their world may become increasingly narrow, centered around the relationship and the effort to maintain it. Even when they are physically away from the narcissist, the psychological presence remains. The internalized voice of criticism, doubt, and judgment continues to influence their thoughts and behavior. Leaving a narcissistic relationship is often far more complex than it appears from the outside. It is not simply a matter of recognizing that the relationship is unhealthy and deciding to end it. There are often multiple layers of attachment, including emotional bonds, shared history, practical considerations, and deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and feeling. The individual may fear the consequences of leaving, including financial instability, social repercussions, or the loss of a sense of identity. They may also feel a strong sense of responsibility for the narcissist, believing that they need support, understanding, or care. Even after leaving, the effects of the relationship can persist. The patterns of self-doubt, guilt, and hypervigilance do not disappear overnight. The individual may continue to question their perceptions, struggle with setting boundaries, and feel uneasy in healthier relational dynamics. Healing involves not only creating distance from the narcissist, but also rebuilding a sense of self that has been compromised. This includes learning to trust one's own thoughts and feelings, recognizing the validity of one's experiences, and developing a more balanced and compassionate internal dialogue. Ultimately, understanding what it feels like to love a narcissist requires moving beyond simplistic labels and acknowledging the complexity of the experience. It is not just about being in a difficult relationship. It is about being in a system that systematically undermines one's sense of reality, worth, and agency. It is about navigating a landscape where love and harm are intertwined, where hope and disappointment coexist, and where clarity is often elusive. By bringing these dynamics into focus, it becomes possible to see the relationship for what it is, to recognize the patterns that sustain it, and to begin the process of reclaiming one's autonomy and well-being.